It was a pretty scary period in our lives already. Besides COVID, we've been having to deal with another threat. For about a month, there's been a lot of young women going missing in our area, all of them between the ages of 16 and 25. The authorities believed it had something to do with the major sex trafficking operation that's been going on since forever. It's always been a problem, but not so much to where we have at least 2 girls disappearing every week. When people became aware of what was happening, everyone was careful about leaving the house, especially women. Parents set curfews to earlier times. Some didn't allow their children to leave the house much at all. Most of my female co-workers brought pepper spray to work with them every day. Others got themselves concealed carry permits. I was by the front door one day while looking outside of my living room window, waiting to see the school bus pull up across the street. Brittany was supposed to be home at any minute. The bus typically dropped her off at around 3 o'clock. I'd always go stand by the door 5 minutes beforehand to make sure I saw her get off. A few weeks before the disappearances first started, I'll admit I kinda let my paranoia get the best of me. If Brittany was just 10 minutes late getting back home, I would call her just to see if everything was still going well. When there was no answer, I'd worry myself to death and overthink like crazy, then constantly blow up her phone with text messages. But eventually, I always would see that bus pull up, then take off, with Brittany trotting across the grass soon afterwards. Of course, she thought I was going overboard, but no matter how often she complained about my overprotectiveness, I always did the best I could to make sure she was safe. She was my little angel. Not so little at 16, but still. I open the door when I see Brittany step on the porch. She has a sullen look on her face. "Really, Dad? 5 text messages in 20 minutes? Brittany said. I scratched my head while glancing up at the ceiling. "Well, you're usually here by at least 5 minutes after," I replied. Brittany's sullen expression turns into a smile. "You know the bus often runs late dropping us off, yet you still do this every time." "Here's something else, Dad." Brittany chuckles, stepping in. "They ought to really stop that," I mumbled. "Parents are already worried enough as it is." I close the door behind her, then follow her into the kitchen. "I have a headache. It's been coming back off and on throughout the day," Brittany said. "Hope I'm not catching a cold. Just take some cough syrup. You should feel better by tomorrow, if not the next few hours," I assured. I had no idea how wrong I was. The next morning I found that Brittany's headaches only grew twice as worse. When I stepped into her room, she was slouched over the edge of her bed, groaning and cupping both of her hands on her forehead. I walk over to her and ask, "Geez, what's going on?" She turned and gazed up at me. "Head still hurts. The medicine did nothing," she whined. Brittany tried to stand up, but she fell down on her knees, falling back on the edge of the bed. I picked her up and laid her back into bed properly, covering her up with the bed sheets and tucking her in. "There's no way you're making it to school today. Just get some rest. Then later on when you wake up, I'll fix some soup," I told her. She nodded her head, then turned her back to me. I gave her a gentle kiss on the temple, then headed downstairs. For the rest of the day, Brittany was confined to her bed. I went up and checked on her often, expecting to see her eventually doing something other than sleeping. But unfortunately, almost every time I cracked her bedroom door open and peeped in, she was out. The only time she was awake was when she ate the soup I made her. Sometimes during the day, I could hear her constantly sniffling and coughing. Her head creaked and squealed from her tossing and turning. Every now and then, I'd hear her groan or moan. She didn't seem like she was getting better at all, but it didn't worry me quite yet. as it was only the first day of her sickness. Meanwhile, downstairs, I was engaged in a news story on TV about another missing girl. Her picture was showing big on the screen, with "Have you seen me?" going across the top of her picture in large white text. Her name, age, and other vital information was written below. Soon the picture disappeared off screen and was replaced by a crying woman who looked like she was around my age. She wept and constantly dried her face with a small piece of tissue, begging the camera for any info on her missing daughter. The story continued for the next 10 minutes, next sharing brief details about the other missing girls who went away over the past few weeks. Then, as expected, they started discussing the possible sex trafficking and kidnapping of young women. It was becoming difficult for me to keep watching those news stories, as I had my own daughter to worry about and was already paranoid enough of anything happening to her. Like any parent, it was my worst fear for me to suddenly find out that something terrible has happened to Brittany. Brittany couldn't attend school for the next 3 days, and she was still feeling way too unwell, barely able to step foot out of bed. And during those few days, I took her to the doctor twice. The first time she went, of course the doctor's first thought was COVID. Not hard to believe after considering the fact that none of the NyQuil or Tylenol she's been taking has managed to cool down her symptoms, not even in the slightest. Then the fact that her temperature was 102 degrees. Brittany was tested for COVID on that same day. We got the results 2 days later, which came back negative. After stepping into the doctor's office for the second time, we were told not to start worrying just yet, as colds can last anywhere from 3 to 10 days, even 2 weeks in some cases. The doctor recommended that Brittany stay home for a few more days and continue resting, while still taking some occasional over-the-counter cold medicine. Now, at first Brittany and I were comforted, able to walk away with a sigh of relief after getting the test results back. We were glad we didn't have to worry about the virus lingering within our home, especially for me because I'm older, and we all know how unforgiving the virus is on people within that age range. The comfort didn't last too long, as one day I walked into Brittany's room and found her sprawled across the floor in front of her bed. She was on her side, mouth partially open and eyes closed. I ran over to her, right away starting to shake her and yell her name. "Brittany!" No response. I checked for a pulse. Thankfully, her heart was still beating. I shook her again. "Brittany, come on, please wake up." Her eyes slowly began to open. Then she muttered, "Dad?" I kissed her on the forehead, then hugged her tightly. "What happened?" she asked, moving out of my arms and checking her surroundings. Brittany couldn't remember exactly what went on. She said she was in her room combing her hair one moment, then she suddenly found herself waking up to me yelling her name. I told her that she most likely blacked out, and she should lie down for the rest of the day so she wouldn't injure herself upon falling down if it were to happen again. So I carried her over to her bed and tucked her in. I took her back to the doctor once again after the blackout episode. This time the doctor mentioned many different possibilities along the lines of epilepsy, syncope, and stress. He said no evidence of neurological disorders were displayed, so maybe Brittany was worried or stressed out about something I wasn't aware of. At one point in our conversation, he even leaned forward and asked me if I thought Brittany may have secretly been drinking, as heavy alcohol consumption is also a risk factor for blackouts. I told him I didn't think it was very likely, as I would have smelled it on her breath when I went to wake her. But I did eventually ask her if there was anything she needed to talk about, anything that was bothering her that she wasn't telling. She assured me that there wasn't, and she was just as clueless as I was of what was going on. There were no more blackouts over the next few days. However, the headaches and the fever persisted. Brittany was starting to improve somewhat, as she was no longer confined to her bed all the time. She still rested and slept for the majority of the days, but she was more active than before. Not active enough to start school just yet, but she eventually started doing some of the schoolwork she missed out on, online. One night I was surprised to see Brittany sitting out on her balcony, staring out at our backyard. The dark landscape was filled with trees being lightly brushed by the soft breeze. The half moon glowed in the sky, along with all the stars. I walked up behind her and pulled back the glass door. Brittany turned back and glanced at me for a split second. "Shouldn't you be resting?" I asked. "No, I'm feeling okay. For now," Brittany said, still staring out into the night. Her answer struck me as odd. "What do you mean?" I said. "Well, whenever I'm outside at nighttime, my fever goes away for a little bit. I don't know why that is, but it works," she explained. What she just said had caused one of my eyebrows to raise. Then I giggled. It was a bit laughable to me. I asked her to elaborate a bit more. Then basically she said she noticed that whenever she stayed outside at night, beneath the moon, her fever and headache would temporarily disappear within minutes. The physical relief would also last after she came back inside. How long depended on the amount of time she spent outside. Sounds crazy? That's because it is. I mean, it was so ridiculous I was expecting her to eventually crack a smile and burst out laughing. But oddly enough, she was dead serious. To my surprise, she started to improve even more after spending more time on the balcony at night. Then she became more active, spending even more time out of bed. Eventually, it got to the point where she barely spent any time in bed at all. After 2 weeks, she was ready to start attending school again. Brittany gave credit to her so-called remedy when it came to her recovery. She swore that it was the only reason she was able to return to normal again, but I wasn't quite ready to give in to her wild theory just yet. I constantly reminded her that the doctor already said that colds can last up to 2 weeks, and she simply just got better over time. Of course, she insisted on believing her lunacy. She did pretty well for days after her return to school, but when the late night backyard viewings out on the balcony came to an end, her headaches and fevers gradually started to return. That's when I started to secretly wonder. The setback didn't hinder her progress for good though, because as soon as she started back sitting out in the night, she was able to taste relief again. Although the mysterious cold symptoms were starting to fade, it wasn't over yet. That was only the beginning. The cold symptoms were soon replaced by something else, more psychological than physical this time. As the month came to an end and the moon came closer to becoming full, Brittany's personality started to change. It wasn't long before she started to become irritable and easily angered. We often got into arguments, most of which were over small and petty things. I used to be able to talk and start conversations with her without having to worry about being lashed out on. "Come on, Dad, would you please just leave me alone? I can't step 10 feet without you getting all worried and trying to control me," she once said. Sometimes I would simply just leave her in her room for hours without bothering her. It was way better than dealing with more drama, but just like any typical parent, I assumed that she was just doing what teenagers do. But I still couldn't understand. I've never had these kinds of problems with her before, and Brittany has always had a pretty good attitude around me, around everyone actually. She wasn't a very feisty person. The most daunting part of it all was the fact that sometimes she wouldn't remember when she lashed out. She'd explode 1 second, then minutes later go back to behaving and talking normally as if nothing happened. I was standing by the door and waiting for the bus once again. But this time when the bus pulled up and took off, Brittany didn't come dashing across the grass like usual. Instead, only 2 other girls hopped off and walked their separate ways. Of course, worry started to consume me right away. I called Brittany's cell phone 3 times and got no answer. Then I spammed her phone with aggressive text messages containing uppercase letters, demanding she contact me right away. When an hour had passed and there was still no sign of Brittany, I called up to her school and asked if she was still there. They said there was no sign of her in the building, but they offered to contact the driver of the bus she was on. The result was the same. With panic suffocating me like hell, I scrambled for my phone again and repeatedly dialed Brittany's number until the voicemail came on each and every time. I had to have left her around 10 voice messages. The sound of my voice grew more frustrated after each one. After another hour of nothing from my daughter, I contacted the police and filed a missing persons report. I spoke with them for about 45 minutes, giving them a name, a physical description of Brittany, along with other personal information about her. They told me to keep in touch before ending the call. When I got off the phone, my heart was still racing, as my worst fear may have become a reality. A black cloud hovered over me for the rest of the day. I constantly checked my phone for any messages or calls from Brittany. I tried really hard to convince myself she was alright, even though deep down I was convinced otherwise. I cried myself to sleep that night and didn't want to see tomorrow unless I woke up and saw Brittany by my side. The sound of my cell phone awoke me in the middle of the night. I reached for my phone on my nightstand and answered. "Hello?" I said. "Yes, is this Mr. Chambers?" a masculine voice on the other end asked. "Yes, it is," I replied. I could hear the sound of sirens in the background on his end. "This is Officer Hernandez, and it seems that you've just reported a girl named Brittany Chambers missing a few hours ago," Officer Hernandez said. My eyes lit up. "That's my daughter, yes," I said excitedly. They had found her. Officer Hernandez told me where they were located, and then I hung up. In a hurry, I slipped on anything I could get a hold of nearby before rushing out of the house. The place Officer Hernandez told me to go was located deep in a wooded area. It kind of resembled our backyard, with many trees scattered everywhere in the middle of a gloomy breeze. The moon was full, shining away and beaming down on the landscape. Upon arriving at the scene, I was met with a grisly surprise. Through the windshield of my car, I could see the aftermath of a massacre. There were dead bodies of men, many of them dressed in black suits. They were all gruesomely mangled, ripped apart, and sprawled all across the scene. A few torn halves of bodies with entrails spilling out, along with vital organs on the ground, riddled the area. I saw one guy hanging from a tree. His intestines were wrapped around a thicker tree branch, suspending him in the air while blood dripped from his open stomach. Blood splatter covered many of the trees nearby. Flashing lights from parked police cruisers and ambulance trucks lit the area up. Detectives snapped photos, while paramedics zipped up body bags and carried them on stretchers. I had to look away when I saw one of the paramedics pick up a blood-dripping severed head off the ground. "What in the hell?" I mumbled. I glanced around the area to see if I could find Brittany. At the moment, I couldn't see her anywhere. In fact, it looked like I couldn't spot anyone under 30. I trotted around the scene, frantically shouting Brittany's name while dashing past multiple detectives and paramedics. "Sir, who are you? You can't be here," one of the detectives said. He was about to approach me until I heard the sound of a girl's voice behind me. "Daddy!" I spun around to see Brittany running at me with her arms wide. A Hispanic man with a low buzz cut and thin goatee followed behind her. He wore an unzipped black leather jacket with a police badge dangling in between around his neck. It was Officer Hernandez. Brittany was wrapped in a red blanket at first, until she saw me and jerked it off. Beneath the blanket she had nothing on but a bra and panties. Her hair looked messy and scraggly, like it hasn't been combed in days, although it's only been hours. Brittany started bawling into my arms the moment we met. I kissed her on the side of her head multiple times while trying to console her. I glanced up at Officer Hernandez, who just stood there with his arms crossed. "What the hell happened?" I asked, still hugging Brittany. Officer Hernandez sighed before saying, "It looks like your daughter came close to being another victim of trafficking." Brittany said, "These guys here," he pointed at the mauled men behind him, "followed her after she left campus at school to run to the corner store. A guy in a truck pulled up to her in the parking lot with the gun raised. He told her to get in, and if he tried to run or make a sound, he'd waste her right on the spot," he explained. They brought me out to these woods. Then they almost stripped me naked. After that, I think they were gonna," Brittany cried, unable to finish her sentence. What happened, sweetie?" I asked her gently, knowing well where she was going. "I can't remember what happened after that. I think I had one of those blackouts again. Next thing I knew, I woke up and everyone was dead. Then there was blood everywhere," she said. I glanced at the grotesque scene once again and was reminded of how lucky I was that fate had spared my daughter. I cringed at the sight before looking away. Brittany fell asleep in the car on the way home, but for some reason she kept staring at the moon minutes prior. Officer Hernandez said they'd be returning to question Brittany some more the next day. There were still lots of unanswered mysteries, the main one being how and why Brittany was the only one left alive in the middle of that monstrosity. Then I wanted to know why Brittany was leaving campus alone. She did that often at first, until the disappearances began, and I demanded she stayed where she was until the bus came. I planned on interrogating her on that issue later, but that night wasn't the right time. She had been through enough as it was, and was already in shock. As of what happened to the lowlives that kidnapped my daughter, well, no one knew. The best theory anyone could come up with was that some animal did it, but to hell with those guys. I didn't feel sorry for them one bit. As far as I'm concerned, they got what was coming to them, and if it meant my daughter stayed alive because of it, then I'm glad it happened. When we got home, I offered to prepare a hot bath for Brittany. She agreed, then locked herself in the bathroom for the next half hour. I sat downstairs in front of the TV and waited for her to finish so I could kiss her goodnight and tuck her in before she dozed off. I heard the bathroom door open upstairs, then Brittany trotting to her room afterwards. After some time had passed, I made my way upstairs to check on her. The bathroom door was wide open, and the light was still on. I went in only to see a soaked dry towel lying across the floor, along with some dirty panties and a bra hanging on the faucet of the bathtub. The bathtub was filled with water, and there was lots of shredded hair floating on top, an excessive amount of it, to the point it kind of looked like small piles were forming. The floor was even covered with it. As I started towards her room, I swore I was hearing something. Sounded like there was a little bit of heavy breathing mixed in with low growling. "Honey, are you done in the bathroom?" I said. No answer, just more of those sounds. I walked into her room and saw Brittany standing outside on the balcony, back facing me. She was nude, just standing there staring up at the sky, looking at the moon. But what really caught my eye and caused me to stop in my tracks was the hair covering her body. Short, thick hair concealed her from top to bottom, even the backs of her arms that were visible. Honey? I stammered. She jerked her head backwards, now looking at me with her monstrous face. Brittany resembled a dog-like creature, short and frizzy hair covering her once beautiful face. Her nose and mouth had been combined and warped together to look like a snout. She spun around and raised her hairy arms in the air, curling her fingers, now exposing her long and dangerously sharp claws. I swallowed in fear, just frozen and unable to take my eyes off of my daughter as she stared back at me with her yellow glowing eyes, illuminated a little more from the moonlight above. She let out a growl, showing her slob-dripping canines protruding out of her gums. I came close to turning around and just dashing out of the house, as I was expecting her to lunge forward and attack me at any second. But she didn't. Instead, she turned again, looking up at the moon before letting out an ear-piercing howl into the night.